The American Civil War, a story of brother against brother, of ideals clashing so violently that it tore the nation apart. What led the nation to the brink of destruction, and why did the Southern states break away from the Union? The answer lies in a deep divide that stretched beyond just slavery. Let's journey through history, year by year, to uncover how America fell into its bloodiest conflict. In 1819, the United States stood at a delicate crossroads. The young nation had 11 free states and 11 slave states, creating an even split between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in Congress. This balance was crucial in maintaining peace and political stability. But this fragile balance was about to be tested. As the country expanded westward, new territories were pushing for statehood. Among them was Missouri, a vast territory with fertile land that seemed perfect for agriculture. But there was a problem. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, which could tip the delicate balance in favor of slavery. While Missouri's push for statehood seemed straightforward, it raised an explosive question. Would adding another slave state disturb the balance of power in Congress? In 1819, the House of Representatives was divided, with the northern states opposing the expansion of slavery and the southern states supporting it. The addition of Missouri could tilt the scales, and with it, the future of slavery in the Union. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the resolution. Speaker of the House Henry Clay, a Kentucky politician known for his ability to broker deals, proposed a solution. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state. This would keep the balance of power equal, ensuring no single side would have more influence over the nation's politics. But the compromise didn't stop there. Another key provision of the Missouri Compromise was the establishment of a geographic line across the Louisiana Territory, known as the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. This line essentially drew a boundary across the Western territories. Slavery would be allowed south of the line, but forbidden to the north, with the exception of Missouri itself. This meant that as the nation expanded, the balance between slave and free states would be preserved, at least on paper. But while the Missouri Compromise temporarily solved the issue of state admissions, it was only a band-aid. The line established by the compromise would become a dividing point in the nation, with debates over slavery intensifying in the coming decades. The compromise, while aimed at preserving the Union, was only delaying a larger confrontation over the expansion of slavery. The Missouri Compromise would hold for several decades, but it was clear that the issue of slavery in the United States was far from resolved. In the years that followed, the country would face increasing conflict over the future of slavery, which would only escalate as new territories and states pushed for statehood. The tension would continue to build, leading to violent clashes, the rise of the abolitionist movement, and eventually the secession of the southern states, plunging the nation into civil war. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a pivotal moment in American history, a moment that showcased the delicate balance the nation tried to maintain in the face of deep divisions over slavery, but it also foreshadowed the storm that would come. As the country grew, so too did the tensions that threatened to tear it apart. By the 1830s, a powerful and passionate idea began to sweep across the United States. manifest destiny, the belief that it was the nation's divine right and even its duty to expand across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was gaining ground. It was more than just a political goal. It became a national ideology. But with every new territory the U.S. acquired, there was a shadow looming over the future, the issue of slavery. As more land was claimed, the North and South found themselves at odds once again. How would the new territories be admitted to the Union? Would they be free states or slave states? Among the most contentious issues of the time was Texas. After gaining its independence from Mexico in 1836, Texas sought to join the Union. But there was a major problem. Texas wanted to be a slave state, and this immediately threw the balance between the North and South into jeopardy. While the South saw Texas's admission as crucial for preserving their economic system, built on cotton plantations and slave labor, the North feared that adding Texas would only deepen the divide over slavery. For them, extending slavery into new territories would mean further entrenching the institution that they were actively fighting to end. Despite this opposition, President James K. Polk, a staunch advocate of manifest destiny, was determined to annex Texas. He viewed it as essential for America's expansion and believed it was the nation's God-given right to claim this vast land. Polk's aggressive stance on expansion led to the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would forever change the map of North America. The war began in 1846 when Mexican forces, angered by the U.S. annexation of Texas, clashed with American soldiers on the border. Polk wasted no time in declaring war, driven by his manifest destiny beliefs. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war, with Mexico ceding nearly half of its territory to the United States. This included present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, vast new lands ripe for settlement. But the acquisition of these vast new territories brought with it even more questions. The debate was no longer just about Texas. It was about the future of slavery in all the new lands gained from Mexico. Would slavery be allowed to expand westward? And if so, how would it affect the balance of power in Congress? Texas had been a major factor in intensifying the debate over slavery, but the question now loomed larger than ever. With vast new territories open for settlement, the nation stood on the precipice of a defining moment. Would slavery continue to expand? Or would the North finally succeed in keeping it out of new lands? In the years following the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, the country would be torn between competing ideologies. The North and South had different visions for the future, and the expansion of slavery would continue to be the issue that defined the coming conflict. The annexation of Texas was just the beginning of a series of events that would lead to the American Civil War. But what came next was even more dramatic. The year is 1850. After the tumult of the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of vast new territories, Congress was desperately trying to find a solution to the growing issue of slavery in the West. The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to be the answer. It allowed California to join the Union as a free state, but it did little to settle the question of slavery in the newly acquired territories of Kansas and Nebraska. What happened next would tear the nation apart. The Compromise of 1850 did more than just admit California. It also passed the controversial Fugitive Slave Act. which required Northerners to help capture runaway slaves, further inflaming tensions between the North and South. But the real controversy lay in how the issue of slavery would be handled in the new territories. Enter Stephen A. Douglas, a prominent Illinois senator, who believed the best way to settle the question of slavery in these new territories was through popular sovereignty. In other words, let the people who settled in Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This idea, though seemingly democratic, was about to backfire in the worst way possible. Douglas's law, known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was passed in 1854. It repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had previously prohibited slavery north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. Now, with the stroke of a pen, the door was open for slavery to expand into territories previously considered free. The question was no longer academic. Both sides, the pro-slavery South and the anti-slavery North, now flooded into Kansas with one mission: to win the vote. Kansas became the battleground for this ideological war. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into the territory, each side determined to sway the vote. The idea of allowing settlers to choose had inadvertently turned Kansas into a tinderbox, ready to explode. The violence that erupted became known as Bleeding Kansas. From 1854 to 1859, Kansas was a war zone. Both sides, North and South, engaged in brutal guerrilla warfare, with skirmishes, killings, and attacks becoming daily occurrences. The Free Staters, or anti-slavery settlers, clashed violently with the Border Ruffians, pro-slavery militants who crossed from Missouri to tip the scales. One of the most infamous incidents was the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where the abolitionist John Brown and his followers brutally murdered 5 pro-slavery men in retaliation for the sacking of the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. This act of violence would only escalate the tension, and Kansas became a symbol of the larger fight over slavery. The bloodshed in Kansas galvanized the North. Many anti-slavery activists saw the violence as evidence that slavery was an immoral system, and they became more determined to stop its spread. The Republican Party was born out of this sentiment, rallying against the expansion of slavery and promoting free labor in the West. The violence in Kansas and the rise of the Republican Party marked the beginning of a new political era. The Republican Party became the voice of Northern opposition to slavery, and it would soon become a formidable force in national politics, especially as the presidential election of 1860 loomed on the horizon. As the issue of slavery reached a boiling point, the nation was on the brink of a full-scale civil war. But how did it all come to this? What happened after Bleeding Kansas that set the stage for the Civil War? The year 1857 saw one of the most divisive rulings in American history, the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was an enslaved African-American man who had lived in free territories, namely Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, for several years. He believed that his time spent in these free areas should grant him his freedom. After the death of his owner, Scott, along with his wife Harriet, filed a lawsuit for their freedom, arguing that they had been made free by residing in free states. They believed that living in a free state should negate their status as slaves, based on the principle of once free, always free. At the heart of Scott's case was the question: could a slave who had lived in a free state be considered free? Could he be considered a citizen in a nation that proclaimed all men are created equal? Scott's legal battle began in Missouri, but it quickly ascended to the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. The ruling that came down in 1857 would shock the nation. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered the majority opinion, which was decisively pro-slavery. The court declared that Dred Scott, as an enslaved person, was not a U.S. citizen and thus had no legal standing to file a lawsuit. Taney's opinion went even further, stating that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens under the U.S. Constitution. The court's decision didn't stop there. It also declared the Missouri Compromise of 1820 unconstitutional. The Missouri Compromise had previously restricted slavery from expanding into certain territories, creating a geographical boundary between free and slave states. But now, with the Dred Scott decision, the court ruled that the federal government had no authority to prohibit slavery in any territory. This opened up the possibility of slavery expanding westward into the remaining territories, including states like Kansas and Nebraska, even where people had not voted for it. This ruling set off shockwaves throughout the nation. In the South, many celebrated, seeing it as a victory for slavery and an affirmation of their rights to expand it into new territories. Southern slaveholders, fearing that their institution might be in danger, were emboldened by the ruling, which legally protected their right to own slaves anywhere in the country. But for the North, this was a devastating blow. Abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates were enraged. They saw the decision as a stark reminder that the federal government was now firmly in the hands of pro-slavery forces. Many viewed the decision as a confirmation that the Supreme Court had become a tool for the South to expand and protect slavery, threatening the freedoms and rights of African Americans. The Dred Scott decision also sparked a pivotal moment in American politics. In the North, this ruling served as a catalyst for growing anti-slavery sentiment, and it rallied Northern voters to support the new Republican Party. The Republicans, founded in the 1850s, quickly became the Party of Abolition. Their platform centered around preventing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, which they believed would eventually lead to the extinction of slavery through natural economic growth. The party's stance deeply angered the South, and in many ways, it marked the beginning of the deepening political divide that would lead to the Civil War. Dred Scott himself would not see the benefit of the ruling being overturned. He was ultimately freed by his owner, who chose to grant him his freedom after the case was decided. However, for many abolitionists and African Americans, the Dred Scott decision was a powerful reminder of the institutionalized racism and injustice that would continue to plague the United States. The Dred Scott decision was a pivotal moment in the battle over slavery in the United States. It gave the South the legal ground to continue pushing for the expansion of slavery, while it solidified the resolve of anti-slavery groups in the North. The stage was now set for the violent confrontations to come, and the path toward the Civil War had never been more certain. In 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist who had already made a name for himself in Kansas, embarked on an even more daring mission, one that would send shockwaves through the entire nation. Fueled by his unshakable belief that slavery could only be defeated through violent insurrection, Brown set his sights on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a town with a federal armory, hoping to spark a widespread slave rebellion. On the night of October 16, 1859, John Brown and his 21 followers, including 5 African Americans, made their move. Armed with weapons, they seized the U.S. Armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to rally enslaved people and lead them in a violent rebellion. They had plans to distribute weapons and ignite a revolution that would sweep across the South. However, things quickly unraveled. The expected uprising did not materialize. The local militia arrived at the scene before Brown could gain full control, and soon U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, yes, the very same Robert E. Lee who would later become the South's most famous general, were dispatched to the town. The raid was short-lived. Brown's forces were quickly surrounded by U.S. Marines, and within hours the plan had failed. John Brown, along with his surviving followers, was captured. The rebellion that had been meant to spark the flames of freedom for enslaved people instead ended in failure and bloodshed. Brown was arrested, tried, and found guilty of treason and murder. His fate was sealed. On December 2nd, 1859, he was executed by hanging. But his death did not silence his cause. It only intensified the debate over slavery in America. To the South, John Brown was a dangerous criminal, a madman who threatened their very way of life. His violent actions only confirmed the South's worst fears about the intentions of abolitionists. They saw him as a terrorist, someone who sought to destroy the institution of slavery by any means necessary. But in the North, John Brown was celebrated as a martyr, a hero who gave his life for the abolitionist cause. His raid on Harper's Ferry, though a failure, had electrified the nation. In the years that followed, Brown's name became synonymous with the moral urgency to end slavery. Abolitionists now had a martyr to rally behind, a symbol of the fight for freedom. Brown's actions helped galvanize the abolitionist movement. The raid acted as a catalyst, turning many who were on the fence about slavery into vocal opponents. While Brown's violent methods were controversial, the moral clarity of his cause could not be ignored. For the South, Brown's raid was proof that the abolitionists were willing to stop at nothing. For the North, it was the call to action they had been waiting for. John Brown's raid did not cause the Civil War, but it made the nation's division irreparable. The violence, the anger, and the mutual distrust that followed would only deepen the divide. As tensions grew, both the North and South became more entrenched in their beliefs, and soon the issue of slavery would come to a head on the battlefield. John Brown's raid was a pivotal moment in the lead-up to the Civil War. But what happened next? How did the nation descend into full-scale conflict? The election of 1860 was the breaking point, a pivotal moment in American history. Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, faced off against 3 other major candidates: Stephen Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell. At the heart of the election was the issue of slavery, and Lincoln's stance, while not advocating immediate abolition, was clear. Slavery could not expand into new territories. Lincoln's platform was centered on stopping the spread of slavery into new territories, though he had repeatedly assured the South that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But this was not enough to appease the South, and it was enough to make his election a call to arms for many in the South. Despite winning the electoral vote and securing the presidency, Lincoln received less than 40% of the popular vote, a clear sign of how deeply divided the country had become. Immediately after Lincoln's election, Southern states began to feel threatened. Their way of life, built around slavery, seemed at risk under a president who was unwilling to let the institution expand. South Carolina, the first state to secede, declared its departure from the Union in December 1860. The rest of the Deep South followed suit quickly. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all left the Union in early 1861. In February 1861, these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. With the Confederacy now officially established, the Southern states elected Jefferson Davis, former U.S. Secretary of War, as their president. His leadership was immediately put to the test as the newly formed Confederacy faced the daunting task of asserting its independence from the United States. Lincoln, having been inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States, immediately faced an immense challenge. In his first inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he made one thing crystal clear: the Union would not dissolve. Lincoln's goal was simple yet monumental: preserve the Union, even at the cost of civil war if necessary. He appealed to the South, offering to uphold slavery where it existed, but refusing to allow it to spread any further. Lincoln's tone was one of calmness and reason, but his resolve was ironclad. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy, believing it was an illegal rebellion. Lincoln's position was unwavering. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. While Lincoln called for reconciliation and peaceful resolution, the Southern states were already preparing for war. In the weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, Southern forces seized federal military posts in their territories, including Fort Sumter in South Carolina, one of the last Union strongholds in the South. Tensions were rising fast, and the nation seemed on the verge of collapse. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to quell the rebellion was met with support from the North. But in the South, it only confirmed their belief that Lincoln and the Union would stop at nothing to preserve the United States at any cost. The election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of the Southern states marked the beginning of a conflict that would tear the nation apart. In just a few short months, the United States would be plunged into its most devastating and deadly war, one that would determine the fate of slavery, the Union, and the very future of America. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War erupted at Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of a bloody conflict that would forever change the course of American history. This fort, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was one of the last Union strongholds in the South, and it was here that the first shots of the war were fired, setting the stage for a conflict that would engulf the nation for the next 4 years. After Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860, the Southern states began to secede, fearing that their way of life, built on slavery, was under threat. South Carolina was the first to break away, declaring its independence from the Union in December 1860. In response, Lincoln called for the preservation of the Union, vowing to protect federal property, including forts like Sumter in the seceding states. As the Confederate forces took control of key forts across the South, tensions reached a boiling point. By April 1861, Confederate forces surrounded Fort Sumter and demanded that the Union garrison surrender. The Union troops, led by Major Robert Anderson, refused to give up the fort, insisting that it was still federal property. The Confederacy, now led by President Jefferson Davis, saw Fort Sumter as a symbol of federal authority. Lincoln, on the other hand, was determined not to give in. As the standoff continued, President Lincoln made a fateful decision to send supplies to the garrison, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Confederate States. On April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard demanded the Union forces surrender Fort Sumter. Major Anderson, the Union commander, refused. The next day, on April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., the first shot was fired and the Civil War began. Confederate batteries opened fire on the fort, bombarding it for over 33 hours. The attack on Fort Sumter was a symbolic moment, but it was more than just a military confrontation. It was a declaration of war. The Confederacy had struck first, forcing Lincoln's hand. The Union garrison, outmatched and running low on supplies, finally surrendered on April 13, 1861. No lives were lost in the battle, but the damage had been done. The war had begun. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to put down the rebellion was met with immediate support in the North. But the South saw this as a direct threat to their newly formed Confederacy, and it ignited the fervor for secession across the remaining Southern states. Within weeks, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee would follow South Carolina's lead and secede from the Union. The fall of Fort Sumter changed everything. What had been a political crisis over the future of slavery and state rights had now become a war for the survival of the Union. Lincoln knew that this would not be a quick or easy victory, but he was resolute in his belief that the Union must be preserved at all costs. By the time the war began in earnest, the United States was no longer the same country it had been before Fort Sumter. The North and South were now locked in a violent struggle that would ultimately define the nation's future. The spark had been lit, and there was no turning back. The American Civil War began in earnest in 1861 with a conflict that neither side was fully prepared for. In the early months, there was an overwhelming sense of optimism from the Union. General Winfield Scott, the Union commander, believed the war would be short and decisive. But this assumption was shattered in the first major battle, the Battle of Bull Run. On July 21, 1861, Union General Irvin McDowell marched his 35,000 soldiers towards Manassas, Virginia, with the goal of capturing the Confederate capital in Richmond. Overconfident and untested, McDowell's troops were expecting an easy victory over the Confederates, who were stationed along Bull Run Creek, just 30 miles south of Washington, D.C. Initially, the battle seemed to favor the Union. Early in the day, McDowell's forces drove the Confederates back, capturing strategic positions and forcing them into retreat. However, this early success was misleading. McDowell's army lacked battle experience, and the Confederate forces were able to regroup under the leadership of General Robert E. Lee, who would soon become one of the most respected commanders in the war. The turning point came when General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's brigade arrived to bolster the Confederate defense. Jackson's men formed a defensive line on Henry House Hill, and despite fierce Union efforts to break through, the Confederate forces held their ground. Jackson's bravery and the arrival of reinforcements gave the Confederates the upper hand. As the Confederate counteroffensive gained momentum, the Union forces found themselves in disarray. The once confident troops were now in a full retreat, with many running for their lives back toward Washington, D.C. The battle was a catastrophic loss for the Union, with over 2,700 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and roughly 1,900 Confederate casualties. The defeat at Bull Run set the tone for the early years of the war. It was a devastating blow to the Union's confidence and shattered the notion that the war would be over quickly. Instead, the battle revealed that both sides were poorly prepared and inexperienced, and that the war would be far longer and bloodier than anyone had anticipated. After Bull Run, the Union found itself in a series of bloody engagements with no decisive victories. The war became a war of attrition, where each side was trying to wear the other down through a constant barrage of bloody battles. The Union Army, under new leadership from General George McClellan, began to regroup and strengthen, but Confederate forces, now led by Robert E. Lee, were equally determined. In the fall of 1862, both sides fought fiercely at the Battle of Antietam. The battle, while tactically inconclusive, marked the bloodiest single day of fighting in American history. Over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action, but it was a key moment that set the stage for President Lincoln's next major move. Lincoln, deeply moved by the scale of the death and suffering, knew that something drastic had to change. On September 22, 1862, just days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be freed. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now about ending slavery, making the stakes higher than ever. But the war would continue, with no side willing to back down. The next few years would see both armies entrenched in a war of attrition, with no decisive end in sight. 1863 marked the turning point of the American Civil War. The Confederacy had won several key victories in the early years, but the tides began to shift in favor of the Union. Two crucial battles, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, would change the course of the war forever. First, let's talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. Fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, General Robert E. Lee, having already secured victories in Virginia, launched a bold campaign to invade the North and end the war on favorable terms. His target was Pennsylvania, hoping to win a decisive battle on Union soil that would force the North into negotiations for peace. Lee's plan was to confront Union forces under General George G. Meade in Gettysburg, a small town in southern Pennsylvania. What began as a routine skirmish quickly escalated into one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire war. Over 165,000 soldiers fought in these 3 days of brutal combat. On the first day of battle, Lee's forces pushed the Union troops back, but the Union forces managed to regroup on high ground. particularly at Little Round Top. It was here that Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his men held the line with remarkable bravery, repelling repeated Confederate assaults. The final day of the battle saw one of the most dramatic moments in military history, Pickett's charge. General George Pickett led 12,000 Confederate soldiers in a direct assault against the heart of the Union position at Cemetery Ridge. The charge was devastatingly unsuccessful. With heavy losses, the Confederates were repelled, and Lee was forced to retreat back to the south. Gettysburg was a catastrophic blow to the Confederacy. Lee's defeat marked the first major Union victory on Confederate soil, and it ended the Confederacy's hopes of winning the war by invading the North. The South lost over 28,000 men, while the Union suffered about 23,000 casualties. This battle was not just a military loss. It was a symbolic defeat that crushed Confederate morale. At nearly the same time, General Ulysses S. Grant was fighting his own battle at Vicksburg, Mississippi. This strategic city held the key to controlling the Mississippi River, a vital lifeline for the Confederacy. If the Union could capture Vicksburg, it would split the Confederacy in two and disrupt the South's supply lines. Grant, a determined and relentless leader, laid siege to the city for over 40 days. The Confederate defenders under General John C. Pemberton were trapped inside the city. The Union Army bombarded Vicksburg day and night, cutting off all supplies and forcing the Confederates into a dire situation. The siege was grueling. With no way to break through the Union siege lines and supplies running low, Pemberton was forced to surrender on July 4th, 1863, the same day as the Union victory at Gettysburg. This victory gave the North complete control of the Mississippi River, a critical strategic win that split the Confederacy in half. Vicksburg's fall, alongside the Union victory at Gettysburg, marked the turning point of the war. With control of the Mississippi and the defeat of Lee's forces in the North, the Union now had the upper hand. The Confederacy was divided, and its ability to sustain the war effort was seriously weakened. Grant's success at Vicksburg made him a national hero and a key figure in the Union's war effort. President Lincoln recognized his leadership, promoting him to General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Together they would push forward, determined to bring the war to a swift end. By 1863, the Civil War had evolved into a battle not just for the Union, but for the freedom of enslaved African Americans. Lincoln, deeply committed to preserving the Union, had long been cautious about making the abolition of slavery a central goal of the war. But after the crushing losses of early battles, and with the South showing no signs of surrendering, Lincoln knew the war needed a new moral direction. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, stating that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be forever free. This was a bold and unprecedented move, one that changed the entire scope of the war. It wasn't just a military strategy. It was a moral statement that slavery would no longer be tolerated in the United States. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free a single slave, it fundamentally altered the war's objectives. It gave the Union a moral cause to fight for, and it prevented foreign powers, especially Great Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. For the first time, the Union was fighting not just to preserve the nation, but to end the institution of slavery. But perhaps the most powerful consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation was its role in recruiting African American soldiers. The proclamation allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy, giving the Union a much-needed boost in manpower. By the end of the war, over 180,000 African American soldiers had joined the fight, making up nearly 10% of the Union Army. One of the most iconic African American units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which fought valiantly at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863. Despite facing incredible odds, these soldiers demonstrated their bravery and commitment to the cause. Their heroism not only helped turn the tide of the war, but also served as a powerful symbol of the determination and resilience of African Americans in the fight for their freedom. The Union Army, bolstered by new recruits, began to gain ground. The Battle of Gettysburg, the largest and bloodiest battle of the war, ended in a major victory for the North. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant's aggressive strategy in the West culminated in the capture of Vicksburg in July 1863, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. With the war shifting in the Union's favor, Lincoln focused on securing the necessary political and military support to bring the war to a decisive end. At the same time, the Emancipation Proclamation had set the stage for Lincoln's own re-election campaign, in which he would seek a mandate from the American people to finish what had been started. In 1864, the Union Army under General Grant adopted a war of attrition strategy, wearing down the Confederate forces through continuous battles. With their resources running thin and with no foreign support on the horizon, the Confederacy began to feel the pressure. But the Union still had to push through multiple decisive battles with the goal of bringing the Confederacy to its knees. By 1864, it was clear that the Union would not stop until the Confederacy was completely defeated. Grant's strategy to wear down the South had begun to take its toll, while Lincoln, re-elected in November 1864, continued to lead the nation through the bloodshed, resolute in his goal to preserve the Union and end slavery once and for all. As the Union closed in on victory, Lincoln's resolve only strengthened. He knew that ending the war would require more than military might. It would require the political will to reunite the nation and carry out the promises of freedom that had been set in motion with the Emancipation Proclamation. As 1864 turned into 1865, the Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant were tightening their grip on the Confederacy. After years of brutal conflict, the Confederacy was being stretched to its limits, its soldiers exhausted, its economy shattered, and its cities in ruins. At the forefront of this final decisive phase was General William T. Sherman, who began his infamous March to the Sea. Sherman's march, which began after the capture of Atlanta in September 1864, was more than just a military strategy. It was a psychological blow to the South. His men, numbering over 60,000, tore through Georgia, cutting a 60-mile-wide path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. Everything in their path was destroyed.